Okay, you remember the drawing? You remember that we went over this before? What I want you to do now with regard to your notes, you don't have to copy down every single note that you did before, but if you don't remember something exactly or you got it wrong on a quiz, then make a note to yourself to pay particular attention to those things that you got wrong the first time around. The whole idea is to get you familiar enough so that when a question is on the exam about flying a drone in a particular airspace, your answer likely is going to be no, except what? Except what? Eric? And it's exactly right, except if you have a waiver. But I'll tell you right now that when the FAA asks a question like that, they will indicate whether or not the question is without a waiver or whatever possibility exists. Okay. So the overview is that all over the United States, from the ground up to 1,200 feet is Class G airspace. Then above that is Class E airspace up to 18,000 feet. Then above that is Class A airspace up to 60,000 feet. Then above that is Class E airspace up to 100 kilometers, 328,000 feet. But don't worry about that. Don't worry about above Class A. It's not important. And even the height of Class A is not important because you're going to be taking a test on drones, and it's unlikely, completely unlikely, that the FAA will be asking a question that involves your flight into Class A airspace. But I want you to understand the ramifications of the classes that you're going to be dealing with. So this presentation should be more of a review rather than starting from scratch. But before I go to the next slide, what are the two major categories of airspace? Bounded and unbounded, right. Very good. Bounded and unbounded. And you already know the definition of bounded, right? Types of airspace. Bounded. So what is the definition of bounded airspace? Anybody? Boundary, bounded, boundary, bounded. Does that ring any bells? Boundaries around specific things like airports and restricted areas and warning areas and military areas and War and P, right, exactly. So, bounded airspace is composed of airports, class boundaries, right, because we have more than just the airport itself. There are also boundaries around the class of airspace over an airport. There's our little old friend, Warm P. And what did the W stand for? What does the ARMP stand for? Alert, right? Restricted, military. Population? Does anybody remember what the P stands for? Raise your hand if you know the answer. Pardon? What is it? Prohibited. Everybody had a chance to look at this card that you are going to get in December if I have to drag you kicking and screaming into the test? Don't even say to me, what if we fail? That what if is not in the category. I'm telling you, if one person of all the people that I've taught, if one person out of, say, 600 or 700 failed it, you think that there's a chance you're going to fail it? No. I know you all are at a bright enough level, an intellectually nice level, so that all you have to do is pay attention, follow my instructions on things like I just passed out to you. Do it without cheating yourself, and you will definitely pass the test in December. Then, if you do the essay correctly, you will already have developed the groundwork for a business that you can go into. And then, if it requires money to be spent on maybe a little office somewhere, or you need to have business cards, you need to put out flyers, you'd like to do a little advertising, there are people, I will guarantee you, there are people in the Central Valley with enough money to be able to back you in your venture, who will invest in your little business. So I'm preparing you not just to get a license in December, I'm preparing you to go into business for yourself, even if it's a part-time basis after school or on the weekends, where you could go to somebody and say, yes, okay, I'm charging $50 an hour, and somebody's going to say, well, we're going to be here 2 or 3 hours. Well, that's okay. $100 a day is worth it. Okay, alert areas, restricted, military, and prohibited, right. And the unbounded. Unbounded is almost like everything else, right? Now, you could say, well, wait a minute now. The airspace around the United States is bounded by our territory, right? By our limits. By our borders. Yeah, you can say that, but that's not how I want you to learn. I want you to learn by thinking in terms of unbounded is all over the United States, and bounded is the airports and the restricted areas and the class areas. That's the way you'll never forget. If you learn it my way, you'll never forget airspace. Even your recurrency 2 years from now, if you have to take a recurrency test, you'll never miss a question on airspace. Unbounded, above 60,000 feet. Above 60,000 feet is really Class A, but you don't have to worry about that. Don't even bother writing it down. It's just kind of a little trick question that a lot of people don't know the answer to. And it goes up to 100 kilometers. 100 kilometers is the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, agreement global-wise, with all the nations of the world agreeing that beginning at 100 kilometers above the Earth, it is free and open space. Space, outer space. So, Class A, you remember that little chart a couple of slides ago? The chart went from G on the bottom, E in the middle, A on top. Okay. Class E from 1200 AGL to 17,999. Again, I don't necessarily care whether you remember that it only goes to 17,999, but if there's a question on the exam, and if the FAA tries to trick you in some way by asking you if Class E goes up to 18,000 feet, just try to remember they're trying to pull your chain a little bit. And if the answer is no, it does not go to 18,000. It goes to 17,999. Now, does it go to 17,999? 0.9999? Where does it go, right? Is there a little gap in there between all the nines and nines and between 18,000? Nobody wants to look at it in that kind of a detail. But when it comes to details, if you've never heard the word fractal, anybody ever heard the word fractal? Okay, look up the word fractal, F-R-A-C-T-A-L, fractal. It was popularized by a man by the name of Benoit Mandelbrot, who said that if you look closely enough at the coastline of California, it will become infinite. That's all I'm going to give you. He has a book called The Fractal Geometry of Nature. And if you happen to be in a library someday and you want to look up a very fascinating book, The Fractal Geometry of Nature. So a lot of the animation that's done by, for example, George Lucas, his big operation up there in Northern California, where they animate things like mountains and rivers and seas. That's all done with fractal geometry. Okay, from the ground to 1200 AGL is Class G airspace. There is a caveat here that I want to tell you about, and we'll look at that in the future when we're looking at aeronautical charts. But it doesn't always go up to 1,200 feet. Sometimes, and it's clearly defined on a chart, sometimes Class G only goes up to 700. Because at that particular airport, there is something called an instrument approach. Does anybody know what an instrument approach is? It's a specific procedure that we pilots use in order to land at an airport when it's so foggy we can't see the ground, or we can't see below a certain level, like 200 feet. Which means that we have to be able to follow that procedure exactly and keep descending down, down, down until we can just see what is called the environment of the airport. And once we see the environment of the airport, if we have not gone below the minimum, we can go ahead and land. In the case where there is an instrument approach at an airport or at a little city, that's when Class G only goes to 700 feet. I don't think that's going to come up on the exam for remote pilots because we're talking about remote pilots flying only in VFR weather. But I just want to make sure that if you tell somebody that all over the United States it's 1,200 feet, that's the reason I put in there with some exceptions. It goes up to 1,200 feet. For example, Fireball happens to have an instrument approach to get into Fireball of all places, right? Reedley doesn't. So over Reedley, Class G airspace goes up to 1,200 feet. But over Fireball, it goes up to 700 feet. But in a circle around the airport, not all over the land, just in a very defined way. And on the aeronautical charts, it's defined with color and a shape. We'll look at that later. I told you before, if you really want to try to memorize a chart like this, go ahead and do it. But my caution is that it's a lot more difficult than it is the way I'm teaching airspace. And if you listen to me and follow my way of learning airspace, you're going to be able to memorize it to the point where you'll never have to worry about trying to fight your way through a chart like that. Don't even bother. I mean, I'll give you a copy of that if you're interested, but my suggestion is no. Visibility restrictions. So raise your hand if you know what the standard visibility is for almost all the airspace in the United States, 95% of it. You got it first, Eric. What is it? 3 statute miles. Correct. 3 statute miles. And does that also refer to the drones? Yes. Exactly. That's exactly why no matter what happens, you have to have 3 statute mile visibility when you're flying a drone. That's called visual flight rules. So when you see it on the test, if it says 3 miles, or what is the standard visibility for VFR flying, visual flight rules, you will know that it's 3 miles. Visual flight rules. I mentioned to you before that sometimes pilots or controllers will use VMC, but not very often. It is probably the most appropriate. So if, for example, the controller calls me and says, Dakota 50 uniform, are you in VMC? I can say yes. More than likely, even the controller will say, are you VFR? She's actually saying the same thing. She's saying, are you following VFR rules in VMC, visual meteorological conditions? Okay, so don't worry about the VMC. Just remember the VFR is sort of an all-encompassing mnemonic that be used for visual meteorological conditions. And the other one that you're not going to get involved in, likely at all, I can't even think of an exam question that would bring up instrument flight rules. But if it does, it's the same thing with IFR. If the controller says to me, Dakota 2350 uniform, report VMC if you are in IFR. Instead of saying instrument meteorological conditions, IMC. So IMC is the more technical term for the conditions you're in, but IFR are the rules you're following while you are in IMC. It's the same with VFR. VFR are the rules that you follow when you are in VMC. Okay? The most common in-flight restrictions now: visibility, 3 statute miles. We all answered that correctly, right? Aha! Here's our little cloud cover. I'm giving you the standard for aviation, period. But there's a little bit of a quirk when it comes to drones, right? What is the one thing that is missing from the standard that applies to drones? Above, correct, good, very good. There is no above restriction because you're not going to be going that high. Now, if we're going to be flying drones on Friday, we are going to try to get up high. We may even try to get up to see how high 400 feet is. 400 feet, you may not be able to see the drone at that height because they're so small. But we're going to do a lot of altitude experimenting on Friday to see how well we can manage a drone, even if it's going very, very, very high compared to our eyesight. So it should be fun. Okay. So there's the standard. Nico? Sure. So you can look forward to drone flying on Friday, see how high we can get without losing the drone. And those of you with great eyesight, better be ready. Remember now, you can take the notes you're doing right now and you can compare them to the notes that you took before to make sure you fill in any gaps in the notes that you had before. Now, those are standard cloud clearances. And as I point out, they apply to more than 95% of the sky below 10,000 feet. What happens above 10,000 feet? What changes? Why does it change? Because the speed changes, right? So the restrictions increase in the airspace from 10 to 17,999. You'll remember that Boeing coming out of the cloud, right? How many seconds? 4.4. Why? Everybody remembers 4.4 seconds. Yeah. And that assumes that you're just sitting there still. But if you're heading to the cloud and the Boeing is coming this way, then it's going to be less than 4.4, isn't it? So if you're going at 100 miles an hour in an airplane and you've got 600 mile an hour coming at you, it's going to be 700 mile an hour closing speed. So one of you math whizzes can figure out how far down below 4.4 that turns out to be. How far can you travel? How many seconds does it take to travel 1 mile at 700 miles an hour? 1 point? How many? 4 point, did you say? Okay, don't answer the need for speed like a lot of you did on the quiz the last time. That's not, that was just a way for you to clue your memory. The need for speed, yes, that's right. There is no speed limit above 10,000 feet. So you have a mile horizontally. I don't yet know, but we will know before the test, before you start taking your mock test in December, we will know exactly whether the FAA requires you to know the standards or whether they require you to know only that which applies to drones. Okay? My guess is you will not be asked to remember 500 below 1,000 above 2,000 horizontally, or 1,000 below 1,000 above and a mile horizontally. Those are standards for all aircraft. So my guess is that you will be required to only know 3-mile visibility and 500 below and 1,000 horizontally. Andrew? Pardon? Yes, I can. More? Which way now, back or forward? Everybody done? So these are the cloud clearances above 10,000 feet. And again, I'm pretty sure that the FAA will not be requiring you to know the cloud clearance and visibility restrictions above 10,000 feet. So here it is, a cloud clearance versus a Boeing 777. You already know the answer to that. You know why the restriction goes from 2,000 horizontally to a mile. It's because of the fact that the speed changes dramatically. In a way, you could argue that the FAA was being lenient because what they should have done is they should have, if the speed at 250 divided into, let's say, 1,000 miles an hour, that's 4 times, right? So it should have been that instead of 2,000 horizontally, it should have been 8,000 horizontally. So it should have been 1.5 miles rather than just 1 mile. But they decided on 1 mile because they're hoping that nobody will be stupid enough to be hanging around a cloud above 10,000 feet in an area where commercial airliners are typically flying. And they fly pretty specific routes, whatever you want to call it. Routes, probably a better term. And some of these people, some of the questions that were on the quiz, of course, as you remember, they were on the final exam. It had to do with whether or not the FAA standards were minimum or maximum. They're always minimum. You could set your own maximum. Most pilots do. I would say in drones, though, 3 miles is such a long, long way. If you have a chance somehow or other to try to figure out 3 miles, like when I drive out to Avenal for glider flying, I can see a lot longer away than that. So I pick out something in the distance, and I measure the distance of where it is, and it turns out that 3 miles is a very, very long distance. I'm sure you couldn't possibly see one of our little hub sands even a mile away. And a mile is an awfully long distance, especially to try to pick one of those little things out. So chances are, if you're going to be doing commercial work, as I hope you will next year, you will probably be dealing with very, very large 40 to 50 pound drones that you'll be able to easily see a mile or two away. All right, this was the first This was the first slide we showed. Up to 1,200 feet is Class G airspace. And then the question came up, well, why is it only 1 mile visibility required? And does anybody remember the answer? One mile visibility. Osvaldo. Because why? Well, there are a lot of things happening close to the ground. That's correct. There are things like crop dusting, pipeline patrol, highway patrol, medevac, all sorts of things that take place from the ground level to 1,200 feet that must continue to take place. And that's one of the reasons the FAA recognizes that those things have to take place. And they can be safely done if everybody who is going to fly in Class G airspace understands the pitfalls and the value of flying in that area, in that airspace with those minimal restrictions. I've flown in visibility of 1 mile, and in my airplane, I get 2 miles a minute. So I can only see 30 seconds ahead. Not a lot of time to be able to avoid things like a tower that happens to be up in the air 1,000 feet. Clear of clouds. And you're right, you can fly right up to the edge of a cloud and be legal. Where else can you be legal at clear of the clouds? Where else? Class what?
Class A airspace. Oh, no, Class B.
Well, Class A has no restrictions at all, does it? None. But where do you have a restriction that says clear the clouds? Class Bravo. Class B airspace, remember? 3 miles and clear the clouds. Thank you, Eric. I knew you all remembered that. You're just a little hesitant to tell me outright, right? So why so little? Well, as we talked about before, there is commerce taking place below 1,200 feet. At night, the visibility and cloud clearance in Class G airspace goes to our good old friend 3 miles, 1,000 feet below, 500 below, 1,000 above, 2,000 horizontally, below 10,000 feet. So, an unbounded airspace. Okay, so before we go in now, let's just take Class E airspace, and then that'll do it for today. Class E airspace, if you want to try to remember the mnemonic for Class E is everything else. So you have A, B, C, D, and G, but you got E in there, and E is everything else. So most of the ones that we talked about are Class E airspace is the big one. That's the one that comprises huge chunks of our sky above us all over the United States. Class E. Compared to Class G, we've got what? 17,000 feet of air in E compared to 1,000 of G. Anybody that still keeps talking while I'm lecturing can go sit out in the hallway tomorrow during the lecture. If you can't remember that when I'm talking you don't, then I'll have you sit outside in the warehouse somewhere. Is that what you'd like to do?